Everyone believed Caleb Hart had chosen a veiled Apache woman instead of the gold that could save his ranch. They called him a fool, and they treated her like a burden he would soon regret. But Caleb gave her a locked room, honest work, and the freedom to leave. He did not know that beneath her veil was a scar, beneath her silence was a promise, and in her hands rested the only truth that could save his home. The road from the Red Cliffs to Red Mesa shimmered beneath the afternoon heat. Caleb drove in silence while Mara sat beside him, with the blue veil drawn across the burned side of her face. The bag of gold remained with her father. Every mile carried Caleb closer to a ranch the bank was preparing to take. Yet Mara never apologized for the choice he had made. She had not asked him to choose her, and she refused to behave like a debt he was required to carry. When a wagon wheel sank into loose sand, Mara stepped down before Caleb could help. She gathered her skirt, placed both hands against the wheel, and pushed beside him until it broke free. She was exhausted and hungry, but she watched the road behind them with the caution of someone who knew danger could wear a familiar face. Whenever distant hoofbeats reached them, her fingers moved toward the stitched edge of her veil. News had reached Red Mesa before they did. Men watched from the saloon rail. Women paused outside the mercantile. Their eyes moved from Caleb to Mara and then toward the gold he had refused. By the time the wagon reached the bank, the story had grown crueler. Caleb Hart had thrown away his last chance to save his land for a veiled Apache woman. Some called her a reward. Others called her the burden that would finish what drought and debt had begun. Mara did not lower her head. When the hotel keeper refused to sell her food, she placed her final coin on the counter. He pushed it back without touching her hand. She closed her fingers around it and walked away without pleading. Caleb bought bread elsewhere, but she accepted only half and made it clear she would repay him through work. Silas Vane emerged from the bank in a black coat too heavy for the heat, loudly enough for the street to hear. He reminded Caleb that Hart Ranch would be sold if the mortgage remained unpaid for 3 more weeks. Then, the wind lifted the edge of Mara's veil. For one brief moment, Silas lost all color. His eyes fixed on the pale scar running from her cheek toward her throat. He recovered quickly, but Mara had already seen the truth. The richest man in Red Mesa knew who she was, and the sight of her frightened him. At Hart Ranch, Amos Pike met them at the gate, with the expression of a man inspecting damaged livestock. He warned Caleb that the ranch could not feed strangers, and that bringing an Apache woman home would give the bank another reason to seize the land. Mara asked for no place at Caleb's table and no promise of protection. She offered to sleep in the small room beside the kitchen and work for every meal she received. If Caleb wanted her gone, she said, he only needed to tell her once. Caleb handed her the room key. The lock turned from the inside. Before dawn, Mara swept the kitchen, carried water, and folded the blanket she had used. She moved through the house, as though trying to leave no evidence that she had ever needed shelter. That night, Caleb noticed light beneath her door. Through the narrow opening, he saw Mara kneeling beside the bed with charcoal and brown paper. From memory, she drew the ridges west of Hart Ranch, the dry grazing fields, and a narrow watercourse missing from every recent map. The line ended beneath land Silas Vane was trying to buy. At sunrise, Mara found clean clothes, bread, dried beef, and a few coins outside her door. Caleb had also left a list of work around the ranch, allowing her to choose where she belonged. She selected the kitchen, the medicine shelves, and the horse barn. She refused to enter the ranch office without permission, though Caleb suspected she understood land records better than most men in Red Mesa. Amos Pike gave her the heaviest buckets, the dirtiest stalls, and a saddle buried beneath years of grease. Mara completed each task without complaint. She did not work like a frightened guest. She worked like a woman determined to repay every meal and every hour beneath Caleb's roof. Amos began calling her Caleb's desert prize in front of the ranch hands. Mara never argued. She only looked at him until he turned away. Her silence was not surrender. It belonged to someone who had survived crueler men. That afternoon, a pregnant mare began striking the walls of her stall. Sweat covered its body, and every breath came sharp and broken. Amos declared the animal too weak to save and ordered a hand to bring a rifle. Mara stepped between him and the stall. She lowered the lanterns, removed a twisted strap cutting into the mare's belly, and spread clean straw across the floor. She prepared warm water and crushed leaves from the creek bed. Caleb followed her instructions without asking where she had learned them. For 2 hours, Mara remained beside the frightened animal. She moved slowly and kept her voice calm until the mare stopped fighting the pain. When the foal finally fell onto the straw, trembling but alive, the watching men fell silent. Mara accepted no praise. She washed her hands and asked Caleb to count the hours against the cost of her room and food. That evening, Caleb left her wages on the kitchen table. Beside the money lay a second key. One opened her room, the other opened the medicine storehouse. He was not offering charity. He was trusting her with responsibility. After midnight, splintering wood pulled Caleb from sleep. A shadow dropped from the office window and fled toward the eastern pasture. Caleb followed, but the intruder vanished beyond the cottonwoods. No money had been taken. The ranch ledgers remained untouched. Yet Mara's room had been searched, her blanket torn aside, and the floorboards beside her bed pried loose. Outside the window, Mara found a footprint with a heel worn sharply on one side. A black thread clung to the broken frame, carrying the scent of saddle oil used at Vane Ranch. She had seen that same crooked footprint outside the burning records office 6 months earlier. The intruder had not come to rob Hart Ranch. He had come for whatever Mara carried out of the fire. The crooked footprint forced Mara to reveal more than she had intended. At dawn, Caleb carried the ranch ledgers into the kitchen, where the light was stronger and Amos could not enter without being noticed. Mara studied the mortgage first. She traced the signature with one finger, then compared it with Caleb's handwriting in an old cattle register. The name looked correct from a distance. Up close, the pressure changed in the middle of each letter. Someone had copied the shape, but not the movement of his hand. The ink on the signature was also darker than the ink used in the rest of the contract. Mara examined the notary seal next. She remembered the name because Nathaniel Reed, a federal surveyor, had once rejected documents carrying that same mark. The notary had been dead for nearly 2 years when Caleb's mortgage was supposedly signed. Caleb had believed drought and poor cattle prices were destroying Hart Ranch. Mara now suspected the ranch had been pushed toward ruin through papers created after the money was already stolen. She explained that she had worked beside Reed during surveys of the Western Valley. She copied measurements, translated land agreements, and recorded the locations of wells, springs, and seasonal streams. Her memory of the missing watercourse had not come from a family story. She had drawn it from a federal map that no longer existed. 6 months earlier, the records office holding those maps had burned during the night. The doors had been chained from the outside. Mara escaped through a window after the roof began to fall, but the flames reached her face and neck before she could crawl clear. A body found inside was recorded under her name. The town believed Mara Red Willow had died in the fire. That false death had protected her while she recovered, but it had also given Silas Vane the freedom to call any surviving witness an imposter. Caleb did not ask her to remove the veil. He did not ask whether the scars were as severe as the townspeople imagined. He returned his attention to the documents, treating the truth in her hands as more important than the wound on her face. Together, they examined the ranch accounts. Several pages had been torn from the months when cattle prices were highest. Shipping records showed fewer animals sold than the ranch hands remembered driving to market. Payments had vanished before reaching Caleb's bank account. Amos entered without warning and stopped when he saw Mara beside the open ledgers. His anger arrived too quickly. He accused her of searching for something to steal and warned Caleb that trusting her would cost him the ranch. Mara did not accuse Amos in return. She requested a complete count of the herd, a comparison of cattle brands, and copies of every shipping receipt from the previous 2 years. Facts, she knew, would wound a liar more deeply than an argument. After Amos left, Caleb found a burned scrap beneath the desk. Most of the writing was gone, but one mark remained clear, the emblem of Vane Land Company. If you believe Mara is protecting Caleb for a reason, share your thoughts in the comments. The next discovery would determine whether she had brought danger to Hart Ranch or uncovered the danger already living inside it. Mara turned back to the accounts and completed the missing calculations. If the numbers in the ledgers were false, Hart Ranch had never been as poor as the bank claimed. Before sunrise, Caleb and Mara began counting the herd without telling Amos. They rode separate lines across the north pasture, recording brands, ages, and markings on every animal they found. By noon, Mara had proven that dozens of cattle listed as dead were still alive. Other animals were missing entirely. She compared the count with the shipping receipts and found a simple pattern hidden beneath years of careless numbers. Amos had reported healthy cattle as lost to disease, changed their brands, and sold them through buyers connected to Vane Land Company. The ranch had earned enough money to survive the drought, but much of it had never reached Caleb. Mara rebuilt the accounts one transaction at a time. She did not merely point to suspicious figures. She showed Caleb where the money had entered, where it had vanished, and which false losses had been used to justify the growing mortgage. Caleb wanted to confront Amos immediately, but Mara urged patience. An accusation would only make him destroy whatever records remained. They needed him to believe the missing pages had protected him. Later that afternoon, Mara noticed the cattle refusing to graze near the northern fence. The herd moved restlessly, pressing away from one section as though it sensed danger before the people did. She followed the fence line and found deep cuts in the wire. Only a few weakened strands remained. A hard storm or a single gunshot could send the entire herd through the opening and scatter it across miles of open desert. Caleb gathered the ranch hands. They repaired the fence before dark, replacing posts and reinforcing the weakest ground. Amos claimed the damage came from weather, but the metal had been cut too cleanly. That night, thunder rolled across the valley. Lightning struck beyond the ridge, and the frightened cattle surged north. The new fence bent beneath their weight but held. Without Mara's warning, Hart Ranch would have lost nearly a third of its remaining herd before morning. The men who had mocked her no longer laughed when she entered the barn. After the storm, Mara walked west with Caleb toward the dry ravine she had drawn on the brown paper. She studied the grass growing between the stones, the pale mineral marks along the cliff, and a line of cottonwoods that had somehow survived years without rain. The recent downpour had darkened one patch of earth more deeply than the ground around it. Mara knelt and pressed her palm against the soil. Beneath the loose rock lay the buried channel of an old spring. Caleb's men dug through the afternoon. At first, they found only mud. Then water began to gather at the bottom of the trench. It rose slowly but steadily, cold and clear beneath the Arizona sun. The stream was not yet large enough to save the ranch, but it proved Mara's map was real. More importantly, it proved the water had not disappeared naturally. Someone had altered its course and removed it from the newer land records. That evening, Caleb placed the ranch ledgers in front of Mara and gave her full authority to examine them. Her wages would now equal those of a ranch manager. She had earned the position through results, not pity. Amos understood what the decision meant. Before dawn, he saddled a horse and fled. In his room, Caleb found a narrow black ledger hidden beneath a loose board. It contained payments from Silas Vane, false cattle numbers, and a map marking every ranch surrounding the buried spring. Mara turned the pages until one entry stopped her. The payment had been made on the same night Caleb's younger brother died in the barn fire. The discovery in Amos Pike's ledger changed the silence between Caleb and Mara. Until then, they had worked beside each other because the ranch demanded it. Now they shared a question tied to the dead, and neither of them could pretend it belonged only to the past. Caleb began rising before dawn to leave coffee beside the ledgers. He never waited for thanks. Mara always returned the cup washed and placed in the same spot. The small ritual became part of the ranch, as steady as the sound of boots crossing the porch each morning. When Caleb tore his coat while repairing the western fence, Mara found it hanging near the kitchen stove. She mended the sleeve with thread close enough in color that the repair could be missed from a distance. The stitches were strong, but not perfect. She did not want the work to feel like a gift he was expected to repay. 2 days later, a fence post slipped from Caleb's grip and split the skin across his palm. Mara cleaned the wound at the kitchen table. The sight of blood made her hands tremble, and for a moment, she seemed to be somewhere far from Hart Ranch. Caleb did not ask what she remembered. He kept his hand still until she finished wrapping it. A storm reached the valley that evening. Thunder shook the barn, and the horses stamped against their stalls. Mara froze when lightning filled the doorway. Caleb saw the fear in her face, but he did not touch her or tell her to calm down. He sat several feet away and repaired a bridle while the rain struck the roof. Slowly, her breathing steadied. The quiet respect of that moment did more than comfort her. It showed Mara that Caleb would not use her fear as permission to cross a boundary she had not opened. As the storm weakened, Caleb told her about Daniel. His younger brother had died 8 years earlier when the old barn burned before dawn. Daniel had recently accused someone of selling Hart cattle under altered brands, but Caleb had dismissed the warning as anger between young men. By the time he understood that Daniel might have been right, the records and his brother were both gone. Mara remembered the date in Amos's ledger. The first payment from Silas Vane had been recorded on the same night as the fire. She did not offer Caleb empty comfort. She placed the ledger beside him and showed him the matching entry. The grief in his face did not disappear, but it changed. For the first time, his brother's death was no longer a senseless accident. It was part of something that could still be uncovered. The next morning, Mara removed her blue veil while washing near the kitchen window. She believed the house was empty. Caleb entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and saw the scar crossing her cheek and trailing down her neck. He did not stop. He did not stare or look away too quickly. He placed her cup beside the ledger as he had every other morning, then returned to the work waiting outside. Mara stood motionless after he left. For months, strangers had treated the scar as proof that she was broken, dangerous, or worthy of pity. Caleb treated it as one part of a woman whose judgment had saved his cattle, exposed a thief, and found water beneath dead ground. Later that day, Mara spoke of Hart Ranch as their ranch, without noticing the word, until it had already left her thoughts. The place no longer felt like shelter borrowed from a stranger. It had begun to feel like somewhere her presence mattered. Near sunset, hoofbeats sounded beyond the front gate. A black carriage bearing the seal of Red Mesa Bank stopped in the dust. Silas Vane stepped down beside Amos Pike, a deputy, and a lawyer carrying 2 documents. One ordered Mara's arrest. The other announced the auction of Hart Ranch in 3 days. The black carriage stopped before the ranch house as dust rolled across the yard. Silas Vane stepped down first, dressed as though he had come to conduct business rather than destroy a family. Amos Pike followed him. A deputy and a bank lawyer carried the authority Silas had purchased with forged paper. The ranch hands gathered near the barn. Mara remained beside the porch, her blue veil covering the scar Silas had believed buried with her name. The lawyer opened the first document. It ordered Mara's arrest for stealing a federal seal, burning the survey office, and assuming the identity of a dead woman. The second announced that Hart Ranch would be sold at public auction in 3 days. Silas produced a death certificate bearing Mara Red Willow's name. According to the record, her body had been recovered after the fire and buried 6 months earlier. He claimed the woman before them was an imposter who had used Caleb's kindness to enter the ranch and steal its records. Amos supported every lie. He accused Mara of searching the office, altering the accounts, and taking documents before he fled. The work she had done to expose his theft was now presented as evidence against her. The deputy reached for Mara. Caleb stepped between them without drawing his gun. He examined the arrest order and asked why the seal was blurred, why the signature belonged to a clerk outside the county, and why Silas had brought a bank lawyer to enforce a federal charge. Silas replied that the mortgage allowed the bank to seize Hart Ranch if Caleb sheltered a wanted criminal. Handing Mara over might preserve his final chance of keeping the land. Mara understood the trap. If she resisted, Silas would call Caleb an outlaw. If Caleb used force, the auction would become an immediate seizure. She stepped forward, prepared to surrender before his loyalty cost him everything. Caleb did not claim Mara belonged to him. He insisted only that Sheriff Mercer review the papers and that no man employed by Silas would remove her from the ranch. Mercer arrived before the argument turned violent. After examining the documents, he agreed that Mara would remain until morning and appear publicly at the auction, where the arrest order and mortgage could be reviewed together. Silas smiled as he returned to the carriage. The town already believed Mara was a dead woman, wearing another person's name, and the bank expected Caleb's land to belong to him by noon. Amos paused at the gate. One boot heel was worn sharply along the outer edge. It matched the print beneath Mara's window and the footprint outside the burning records office. Mara now knew who had searched her room. She also knew Amos had been present when the survey office doors were chained. After the carriage disappeared, Mara told Caleb that papers alone would not defeat Silas. Red Mesa had to see that the woman named on the death certificate was alive. At the auction, she would remove her veil and reveal the face Silas had tried to erase. Caleb understood the danger. Once she stood uncovered, everyone involved in the fire would know the final witness had survived. Would you have trusted the documents or stood beside the woman everyone called guilty? Share your decision in the comments. Mara looked toward Red Mesa as daylight faded. The next time Silas saw her face, she would no longer be running. Before nightfall, Caleb gave Mara 3 choices. She could leave through the western hills, return to her father's people, or ride into Red Mesa and face Silas before the town. He would help whichever path she chose, but he would not choose for her. Mara chose the auction. Only then did she explain Chief Red Willow's offer. The gold had been Caleb's rightful payment for recovering the stolen horses. Choosing Mara had never meant accepting her as a wife or possession. It meant agreeing to escort a hunted witness into territory controlled by the man who wanted her silenced. Her father needed to know whether Caleb would protect the truth when doing so might cost him everything. Mara needed to know the same. When Caleb opened the wagon door and waited for her decision, she understood he might be the one man in Red Mesa who would not sell her evidence or her freedom. That night, they brought the mortgage to Sheriff Mercer. Mara compared its dates, signatures, and seals, while Mercer checked the county register. The notary named on the document had died nearly 2 years before Caleb supposedly signed it. The ink was newer than the rest of the contract, and the clerk's name belonged to an office outside the county. The mortgage was false, but suspicion would not stop the auction. They needed an original record or a living witness. Caleb remembered Daniel mentioning a sealed envelope shortly before the barn fire. His brother had left it with Reverend Bell because he no longer trusted the ranch office. They rode to the church after midnight. Reverend Bell opened the iron box beneath the vestry floor and found the envelope. Inside was a copy of an old water agreement signed by Caleb's father. It named Nathaniel Reed as the federal surveyor who had witnessed the boundaries and access rights. Reed was still alive in a settlement a day's ride east. Caleb sent a trusted ranch hand to bring him back before the auction. Sheriff Mercer agreed to keep the search secret. If Silas learned a federal witness had been found, Reed might never reach Red Mesa. Mara copied the ledgers by hand and divided the pages into 3 bundles. She hid them beneath the church floor, inside Mercer's office, and behind a loose stone near the western spring. If one copy burned, the truth would survive. Near dawn, the horses began screaming. Flames raced up the barn wall. Caleb and Mara entered the smoke and opened the stalls, while the ranch hands carried water. One by one, the horses escaped into the yard. Through the smoke, Mara saw a man slip from the rear door, carrying her leather bag. Caleb chased him beyond the fence, but the rider disappeared. By the time the flames were controlled, the roof had collapsed, and the bag containing the bloody federal seal was gone. Silas would believe he had taken the last piece of evidence. Mara watched the barn burn down to glowing beams, then removed the blue veil. The real proof, she told Caleb, had never been inside the bag. While the barn collapsed into embers, Mara carried the blue veil into the ranch house and placed it beneath the strongest lamp. Caleb and Sheriff Mercer watched as she opened a line of tiny stitches along its inner edge. Between 2 layers of cloth lay a narrow federal survey map, a list of coordinates, a file number, and a letter bearing the signature of Caleb's father. The bloody seal inside the stolen leather bag had been a copy. Mara had carried it openly, so the men hunting her would believe they knew where the evidence was hidden. The true record had remained against her skin since the night she escaped the fire. Years earlier, Nathaniel Reed had surveyed the Western Valley, with Mara serving as his translator and record keeper. His work confirmed that Hart Ranch could use the spring beneath its western land, but ownership carried one permanent condition. The Hart family had to protect the water route shared by nearby homesteads and the Apache settlement beyond the Red Cliffs. Caleb's father had signed the agreement as guardian of that passage. No sale of the ranch could legally close the route or give complete control of the spring to one landowner. Silas Vane had spent years buying the surrounding properties. Hart Ranch was the final piece. Once he controlled the spring, he could force ranchers to sell, drive Mara's people from the dry country, and charge the valley for water that had never belonged to him alone. To obtain the land, Silas created a debt Hart Ranch did not owe. Amos sold cattle under altered brands and concealed the income. Bank records were changed to make the ranch appear insolvent. New maps erased the spring, while a forged mortgage allowed Silas to seize the property before anyone discovered its value. When Reed sent copies of the original survey to the records office, Silas ordered the building burned. The doors were chained from outside. Mara escaped through a window, but a young federal clerk who had helped protect the files died inside. The blood on the copied seal belonged to her. Officials mistook the burned body for Mara and issued a death certificate before making a proper identification. Silas encouraged the mistake because a dead witness could not challenge his maps. Mara recovered at a remote mission hospital, where records of her burns and arrival date still remained. The same scheme reached into Caleb's past. Amos's hidden ledger showed Silas paid him on the night Daniel Hart died. Daniel had discovered the stolen cattle and hidden records proving the theft. The old barn was burned to destroy those pages. Daniel's death had not been an accident. It had been the first killing committed to protect the water scheme. Near dawn, Mercer's deputies captured Amos returning for a horse. When he learned Silas had taken the leather bag and abandoned him to face the fire alone, his loyalty broke. He agreed to testify about the altered brands, both barn fires and the forged bank records. A rider soon appeared on the eastern road with word that Nathaniel Reed was alive and traveling toward Red Mesa with his original survey journal. Mara folded the veil beside the evidence. For months, people had seen only a silent woman hiding a scarred face. They had never understood that she had memorized the land, preserved the records, survived an attempt on her life, and protected the agreement capable of saving Hart Ranch and the entire valley. Silas still refused to delay the auction. He believed Red Mesa would trust his wealth over an Apache woman declared dead by official record. By noon, Mara would stand before the town without her veil, and Silas Vane would learn that the witness he had buried was carrying the truth to his front door. By noon, the square outside the Red Mesa Bank was crowded. Ranchers, merchants, church families, and hired men stood beneath the hard Arizona sun while Silas Vane waited beside the auction platform. Hart Ranch had been valued at less than its cattle, and Silas was the only buyer prepared to bid. Caleb arrived with Mara at his side. She wore no veil. The crowd fell silent when they saw the burn scar crossing her cheek and neck. Silas had spent months convincing Red Mesa that Mara Red Willow was dead. Now the woman named on his death certificate walked toward him, carrying a wooden document box. Sheriff Mercer stopped the auction before the first bid. Silas protested that a criminal accusation could not erase a legal debt, but Mercer ordered every document read and examined in public. Mara began with the mortgage. She showed that the notary had died nearly 2 years before the paper was signed. The ink on Caleb's copied signature was newer than the contract, and the clerk named beside it had never worked in Red Mesa County. Next came the ranch accounts. Mara laid out the missing cattle, altered brands, false death reports, and payments that had disappeared through companies controlled by Silas. Hart Ranch had not failed because Caleb was careless. Its earnings had been stolen, then used to create the appearance of debt. The map beneath her veil revealed the reason. Hart Ranch guarded the spring that supplied the Western Valley. Caleb's father had signed a federal agreement protecting access for small homesteads and the Apache settlement beyond the cliffs. Silas could not legally own the water alone, so he had erased the spring from new maps and forged a mortgage to seize the land before anyone found the original record. Reverend Bell stepped forward and confirmed that the sealed letter had remained beneath the church floor since Daniel Hart left it there. The letter warned that cattle records were being altered and that men connected to Vane Land Company were searching for the water agreement. A wagon appeared at the edge of the square before Silas could answer. Nathaniel Reed climbed down carrying his original survey journal. He confirmed the coordinates, the signatures, and Mara's work as his translator and record keeper. He also confirmed that copies of the survey had been delivered to the records office shortly before it burned. Then Sheriff Mercer brought Amos Pike from the jail. Amos admitted selling Hart cattle under changed brands, cutting the northern fence, searching Mara's room, and setting fire to the new barn. He confessed that Silas had ordered the earlier barn fire after Daniel discovered the theft. Daniel's death had been treated as an accident because the records proving otherwise were destroyed with him. Silas tried to dismiss Amos as a frightened liar, but the dates in the black ledger matched bank deposits, land purchases, and both fires. Every separate piece of evidence pointed toward the same design. Sheriff Mercer canceled the auction and placed Silas under arrest for fraud, bribery, arson, and conspiracy to seize protected land. The forged mortgage was removed from the sale record, and the case was sent to federal authorities. The people who had called Mara a burden now stood before the woman who had saved their water, Caleb's ranch, and the truth about Daniel's death. Mara did not demand apologies. She asked only that her living name replace the false death certificate. If this moment of justice stayed with you, share the story with someone who still believes truth can survive cruelty. Save the video and subscribe for more stories about courage, dignity, and the quiet kindness that changes lives. That evening, the road back to Hart Ranch should have felt like a victory. Instead, Caleb found Mara's belongings packed beside the kitchen door. Mara's belongings rested beside the kitchen door in the same worn bag she had carried from the Red Cliffs. Her room was already swept, the blanket folded, and the medicine key placed carefully on the table. She believed her work was finished. Hart Ranch was safe. Silas Vane was in custody. Her father's people had regained their water rights, and her name would no longer belong to a dead woman in a false record. Remaining now might turn gratitude into obligation. Mara had spent too much of her life being treated as something owed, traded, or claimed. Caleb did not block the doorway. He placed her full wages beside the medicine key, along with a document naming her as the ranch manager whose work had prevented the foreclosure. Outside, a saddled mare waited with food and water for the journey. He had prepared everything she needed to leave with dignity. The choice was hers, just as it had been when he opened the wagon door beneath the Arizona sun. Caleb made no promise that Hart Ranch would collapse without her. The water was flowing again, the cattle were safe, and honest accounts now rested inside the office. The ranch could survive. But survival, he had learned, was not the same as having a home. Before Mara came, the house had been filled with closed rooms and memories no one touched. She had brought order to the ledgers, strength to the fields, and warmth to a kitchen that had known only silence. She had not merely saved his land, she had returned life to the man living upon it. Mara looked toward the open door. For the first time, someone wanted her to remain while making certain she was free to go. She removed the blue veil, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the window. It had protected the truth through fire, pursuit, and fear. She no longer needed it to hide her face. Her bag remained beside the door until sunset. Then she carried it back to her room. Spring came slowly to the western valley. Water moved again through the old channel, passing Hart Ranch before continuing toward the small homesteads and the Apache settlement beyond the cliffs. Grass returned to ground that had seemed dead, and cattle spread across the green pastures. Chief Red Willow visited when the first cottonwoods began to bloom. He found Mara standing on the porch beside Caleb, her face uncovered in the morning light. He had never offered his daughter as a possession. He had trusted her to recognize a man who would respect the freedom others had tried to steal. Caleb and Mara married in a small ceremony shared by both communities. No gold rested upon the table. The blue veil hung near the ranch door as a reminder that truth could be wounded, hidden, and hunted without ever being destroyed. Caleb had not chosen a woman instead of gold. He had chosen what was right when the price was highest, and that choice had led them both home.